Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us here on Right Now, streaming on the CBS 8 app. I'm Chris Gros, joined here, as always, by Jack Hole. Today is June 8th, and we are 6 days post-primary election day here in California. And wouldn't you know, as something that we have sort of alluded to in some of our recent coverage, we are not only still getting reports on the very latest in the governor's race as well as other races, but we are beginning to see some of those critiques that we said are likely to happen here because of California's counting system. It's all coming to fruition.
It was very much expected.
Yeah.
This was something that we saw. We saw the precursors to this conversation taking place before the election in general. We saw Governor Newsom talking to county election officials and urging them to speed up the process. Essentially, what he was saying was, we don't think that there is anything, there's no such thing as the manipulation of voting data or anything like that. However, he understood that the more time it takes to get the information out there, the more it allows that conversation and that discussion to grow, as we have seen in previous elections. And whether you want to count it as misinformation or legitimate critiques, there is scrutiny that is being applied to the system right now as we speak.
Yeah, for sure. And a large part of that is because just the way that things work, voter habits, the way it appears, I think, more than anything, raises some fears amongst people or just maybe even, as you said, critiques and concerns. So let's dive right into it. Let's talk about what it is that we are seeing. The very latest vote results just came in here for the governor's election, and you will see that there is a new name on top here. Xavier Becerra now is in the lead, and because of the math, meaning how many votes remain outstanding, how many votes that he has collected, he is guaranteed to be one of the two that will move on to the general election. Steve Hilton, who was previously in first place at about 20% of the total votes counted, is now in second place, the lone Republican here in the top three. And as we said, Tom Steyer is still here technically. Again, we are rounding up with 22% of the vote. He has closed the gap a bit, but needs a lot of help here. As said, this is a bit of a miracle, a Hail Mary for his campaign if he ends up being one of the top two. But still technically in it here, Jack, with less than 30% of the ballots remaining.
Yeah, and it's not a surprise here to see that the gap between Steyer and whoever was in second place. I know that earlier, late last week, it was Steve Hilton who was on top and Becerra who was behind. Of course, there's been more votes that have been counted since then. We're not surprised to see some gap of any sort close, whether it was Steyer with Hilton or Steyer with Becerra, because we'll get to the details about how these ballots are counted. I know that this is something that you've been talking about all morning, something that we thought would be good to kind of dive a little bit deeper into. But essentially, what you will notice, the normal trends are, especially here in California, is that the later on you count these ballots, you're getting a lot of mail-in ballots. Mail-in ballots tend to heavily lean Democratic. So we knew that those numbers and that percentage that we were going to see from Hilton was going to drop, and you were going to see gains from either Becerra, Steyer, or both. So the question of that matter was, how much was that going to be? Even on Wednesday, when we were talking to Wendy Patrick and Laura Fink, their analysis was, it was essentially already a Hail Mary for Tom Steyer, that the deficit that he had already faced coming in just 12 hours after Election Day was so great that none of these ballots that were going to be counted thereafter would necessarily be enough to close that gap and get him into November. Now, it hasn't been called yet. You're taking a look right there. They're separated by a little bit over 300,000 votes. In terms of percentages, it's about 4.5%. There's 28% left of votes being counted. So a hypothetical possibility, yes. If it wasn't, the race would have been called already for Hilton to advance. Yeah. So it's going to be interesting where things go. We do expect it to be heavily Democratic, but he's not the only Democrat there. There is Becerra as well. So not only will he have to get more votes than Hilton, he's going to need to get more votes than a man who has already advanced. So that's where the challenge lies.
And again, this is, if you go back through our reporting, I know that for a lot of people that are not wholly consumed with this topic, they might think a lot of this is random, but we said the trend that we were seeing here, especially for this election with a crowded Democratic field, that it was the Democrats who were holding, they were ballot clutching was the term, or strategic voting. So it's not even the mail-in ballots. It's also just those last people to vote in person, those people who literally postmarked it on June 2nd. Yes, those are all likely, or a majority of the votes that we are seeing being counted now. We were seeing the trends play out on top of the fact that in most elections, that is generally speaking the trend. We know the Republicans like to do early voting as well as in-person day of voting, and then a lot of mail-in voting takes place on the Democratic side.
Yep.
So this is just simply playing out. But I think this always becomes fodder for conversation because at the end of the day, this is a bit of a competition, if you will, and both sides are going to take a look at how things are being done.
And we're going to heavily focus this conversation centered around the governor's race, but we do want to mention that you are seeing the same dynamics that are being played right now in the LA race for mayor. Karen Bass, of course, has already advanced to that November runoff. What happens, it's a nonpartisan election. Everyone runs as an independent, essentially, and if a candidate in this election specifically gets over 50% of the vote, then there's no runoff, and that's the election as is. However, she has been called to advance because she's in a situation where she will be the number one vote getter, but she's not able to reach that 50% threshold, in case anyone there was wondering. But when we hopped out of the weekend, it was Spencer Pratt, the former current reality star turned politician, mayoral candidate, who was in that second place spot right behind Karen Bass. Now that we have seen Ramon, city council member, I believe, jump into that second place again, to be clear, it is still incredibly close. You're looking at just a little over 3,000 votes. That is 0.4% separating the two, but the same dynamic at play. You see that Democrat, she's not listed as a Democrat here on the ballot, but that is her registered party, just for context. You saw her behind going into the weekend, and as these votes get counted in, they do lean heavily Democratic just based on voting habits. It is an issue of voting habits more than anything else. You see her jump into there. So, and to go so far as to that issue, we also heard here, let me find it. The Justice Department actually was knocking down some conspiracy theories about this race in particular. There was a department official in LA that was addressing a rumor on social media that said that Spencer Pratt received no new votes in an updated ballot count over the weekend. The Justice Department went out to say that that was false, and that they called the allegation baseless. So, you know, when there is they call it the red mirage, and that's usually used in electoral, like presidential politics. And more specifically during the COVID era was when it was, I would say, very prevalent. But you do see the same thing at play in a state like California, which California, like, the 2020 election and to a certain extent the 2024 election, really utilized mail-in ballots. A lot of times that was a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but just due to the political attitudes toward it, you did see that Democrats were more inclined to use those methods of voting, and based off of the mechanisms that we see here in California, it does take a long time to count those votes. So we'll get into all those details here in just a second here, Chris.
Yeah, but we are hearing criticism. In fact, as we said, we're going to take a focus here on the governor's race. Well, there is one person in particular, Republican candidate Steve Hilton, who is taking a shot. Last Wednesday, we saw him in San Francisco criticizing the state's process and calling for an emergency program to assist counties with faster counting.
This shambles is absolutely shameful for our state. India counts over 640 million votes in a day.
Wow.
California cannot count less than 10 million votes in a month.
Yeah, some strong words. We're going to get into those details here in just a second. That drew a quick response from the office of Governor Gavin Newsom saying, quote, "It's concerning that a candidate for governor doesn't know the governor has nothing to do with counting ballots." Of course, it is the county election officials. The Secretary of State is the one who is charged with the verification of those votes. But we
also, India used, by the way, as an example, who just recently, I remember hearing about it. There was a huge controversy, by the way, of India and a voter stuff. So India, maybe not the best example to be used in terms of counting votes, because they're going through their own bit of controversy right now, or at least had the 2025 electoral controversy that occurred.
But you do know that, and we both understand that Hilton is playing to what is a frustration.
Yes.
Among a lot of people, candidates themselves. I mean, I know he's probably one of those. He believes that he's performed very well, and I think the numbers dictate that he has been a very strong performer in this primary, and yet we still aren't entirely sure whether or not he's going to advance to the general election. So that's something that we've heard from Republican and conservative voters. It's something that we've heard from some Democratic voters here, especially here in the last couple days, just anecdotal evidence that we've seen throughout the various punditry and some of the news that we've seen around it. It's either a frustration or an acknowledgement that perhaps there's an opportunity to retool the system as it is. But before we get into that, let's talk about the system itself.
Yeah.
Governor Newsom mentioned that Steve Hilton perhaps doesn't know about it. That was the charge that his office made. So let's describe it. How about that?
Yeah. And look, this is something that I think we attempted to sort of weave in with some of our other reporting that was going on throughout last week, because I think it's important. It gives context, because let's face it, there are allegations of impropriety. Now, you can argue, we were saying this before we started the show. I think there can be fair criticisms of the efficiency of the system. But we are beginning to see, and there have been lobbying of election fraud, of nefarious actions taking place. And as we have noted on this show, there's been a lot of research done into voter fraud, and the Heritage Foundation notably has an archive, and there's not a whole lot of evidence to suggest that.
It happens, but it
happens, but on
not
such a small scale.
Yes, there's no recorded in my experience and in my research. There's not been one recorded incident where it has happened at a scale large enough to sway the outcome of an election.
So let's talk about the process, though, because I do think that there is a good conversation to have about why it is that we have the process. You mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, California also has a huge voter base, 23 million registered voters as of last count. We also don't know. There could be even more after this primary election season. A lot of people register and cast provisional ballots.
That's an average. That's according to the Secretary of State's website, most recent version.
People fall off the voter roll. They come back on.
Yeah, so you're right. That number could be even larger now.
So how does ballot counting work? Well, on election night, county election officials must begin reporting results to the Secretary of State no more than 2 hours after tallying begins once polls close. The first results that are released are typically ballots received before Election Day. This is something that we talked about last week. Those mail-in ballots that actually get there early because people are, good stewards. They get their homework done, if you will. Those are the ones that are released. So essentially, these register our voters in every county at 8 p.m. Generally speaking, that's when polls close. But those results are released right around 8 p.m. Those are results that are already in hand. They just can't be released until 8 p.m. But those vote-by-mail ballots that are sort of open and processed up to 29 days before Election Day, those results aren't posted until after, again, those polls are closed. Additional results posted on Election Day include those in-person ballots that are cast on Election Day early, in-person ballots, as well as those mail-in ballots. County election officials then have a 30-day canvass period to continue counting votes. They could experience ballots that don't have a signature on them. They have 24 hours to call that person to verify that they voted a certain way. So there's all of these things that happen in the canvassing period to make sure that all votes are counted. They process these ballots, those provisional ballots as well too. Same day voter registration ballots then begin to get counted. Ballots postmarked by Election Day and received within 7 days of Election Day are then counted. So we're kind of going through the timeline here. And I would say that by now, what we are seeing are those ballots that have been postmarked and received within 7 days. Those are the ones that we're going to start to begin, that are being literally updated in our count right now.
And I think that's why you're seeing a Ramon
Yeah.
Leap themselves ahead of Pratt. You're seeing Steyer have some decent gains right now. Like we've mentioned, it is a heavily Democratic voter bloc traditionally. Again, every election is different. We don't know how these trends work. We did see mail-in ballots and some of these other methods of voting become a little bit more prevalent for Republicans during the 2024 election. So there's a chance we see that trend continue more and more, and that Democratic influence in this block of voting becomes less and less. But following the trend and seeing what we're seeing here, I would say it's relatively safe to say you're seeing that at play right now.
Yeah. Again, this looks like it's swaying elections, but I always caution people, we don't really know what the election looks like until we've got all the votes counted, right?
Yeah.
And by, again, the process can be criticized, but at the end of the day, I think it's always one of those things that we especially try to make sure that people are aware of, is that, hey, look, these results can change. This is not the final. And it's really important to remember that, especially in a state like California, where the opposing party, the Republican Party, is trying to make inroads. Like, they are trying to make gains here in this state. And I think that the appearance of these initial ballots that get released can always make it sort of like a false confidence, if you will, especially amongst the voters. And then, as you know, the chumming of the waters, like we're seeing Hilton and like we're seeing President Trump get to, which we're going to talk about in a little bit here, a little bit more about that, Jack.
Yeah. I mean, if you're a Republican voter or if you're a Republican candidate, it kind of changes the way in which you watch the election play out on election night. It's oftentimes, and I keep mentioning presidential elections because 2020 and 2024 operated in very similar ways in which we're seeing an election like this play out now. Whereas in 2020, you were seeing President Trump build a somewhat decent lead. That was a very close and a very contentious election. But going into, the 8 o'clock, the 9 o'clock hour of that election day in 2020, you saw President Trump with sizable leads in all the key swing states. And the question is, was that lead big enough? As we saw those mail-in ballots come in and get voted, we quickly realized that the lead that President Trump had built going into the night of Election Day onto that Wednesday was not large enough to fend off this swath of votes that, again, due to voting trends based on political ideology, political demographics, leaned heavily towards President Biden, then candidate Biden. Fast forward to 2024, we saw the same thing at play, but President Trump was able to build a much larger lead, a lead that we were able to, that same night, very different from 2020, a lot of the states were being able to be called because it was very quickly realized that whatever votes were remaining, votes that still would be heavily in favor of Vice President Harris, was not enough to overcome that. So it kind of changes the way in which you view these elections. Now, it's the same thing being played out here, especially if you're someone like Steve Hilton, where it is, you've built a very sizable lead going in. Can you keep that lead to get yourself into the runoff? Same thing at play, but the timeline just seems to be very much extended here.
Yeah, and again, especially when we're talking about the LA mayoral race, which I think for a lot of people, that got national attention in large part because of Spencer Pratt. But Nithya Raman and Karen Bass, while again this is a nonpartisan election, I think it's very important to people to remember that LA, in particular, the city of LA, because I think for a lot of people, the coverage of the LA mayoral race, even within the county of LA, now I'm branching out to the county, there were a lot of people who said that they were going to vote for Spencer Pratt and then realized that they don't live in a district in which they can vote for Spencer Pratt. And I think also that was at play. There are people who live in the county of LA who got excited about that mayoral race only to find out that they are not in the city of LA. And I know that sounds shocking, but that's true. There was a lot of online enthusiasm for Spencer Pratt, only for people to find out that they're not in an area in which they are governed by the city of LA. But then on top of that, this is a city that is heavily Democratic, maybe even more so than the actual entire state of California. In fact, I believe there's 3 million registered Democrats as of April of 2026 and only 1 million Republicans. And then as for independents, and that's because that would be no party preference, about 1.4 million. So this was one in which we were likely going to see at least one of the Democrats, and it was always going to be one of those things for a newcomer like Pratt to make that big push. But look, it's also still neck and neck. That's the other thing too, is that Spencer Pratt still could make his way into the general. It has not been called yet for Nithya Raman.
And we're in no way implying that
No.
it is not the case anymore.
We know that there were
certain trends.
Anecdotally, we heard there were Steyer Pratt voters. There were, again, as we see more and more of these votes come out, that is a race that, despite identity politics or party politics, I should say, there were still mixed ballots. So we'll have to see exactly
we heard
how
a
that
lot of
shakes
people
up.
who said that it was less about ideology as it was
Frustration
with the incumbency. And Karen Bass in particular.
Yeah.
Especially, you look at someone like Spencer Pratt, who was affected personally by the Palisades fire. That's something that resonated with a lot of people.
And we should point out, though, Nithya Raman, while a part of that city council, it was a very unpopular move amongst the city council. I just saw an interview with one of the other city council members who said she believes that Nithya Raman is backstabbing Mayor Bass. Like her running to challenge Mayor Bass is seen as someone who is trying to sort of like buck the trend of the Bass administration.
And if you're Karen Bass, and if you had to pick of the two, which candidate you'd much rather face in the general, you're going to pick Spencer Pratt.
Her campaign
9
elevated
times out of
Pratt.
10. Yes.
Yeah.
And you see that a lot. That was one of the things when we were having the conversation about the jungle primary. It was that situation where if you're a front-running Democratic candidate, you are more inclined to elevate the Republican than you are to, decimate the Republican at this stage in the election, because you want the easiest path post-primary to get the election that you're running for.
Yeah, I would venture to say Becerra would much rather run against Hilton. Again, 100%.
Statewide. If you were to talk to anyone within his campaign, they would completely agree with you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That is going to do it for the first part of our conversation here when it comes to voting and sort of the reaction that we've been seeing. We're going to jump into that now viral back and forth exchange that we saw President Trump have walking out of an interview on this very topic. We're not walking out, though. We'll be back in 2 minutes. All right, so I think that was a pretty good conversation that we just had here in that first block, in which we were talking about what some of the attacks and criticisms were on the system in which California uses to count ballots. And remember, we're only in primary season.
Yeah.
We still have a whole general to get through. But this has also made national news, in large part because we have seen that President Trump, who has been a frequent critic of a number of elections, but also California's, continued that attack over the weekend, claiming without evidence that results are being delayed or manipulated. In fact, he had this back and forth on NBC's Meet in the Press with Kristen Welker, who pushed back on that lack of evidence, and it led to a very fiery exchange where we saw this ultimately happen.
Do you think it's appropriate that they have an election and 5 days later they're nowhere close to picking a winner?
State and local officials acknowledge they are slow. They're urging.
No, they're crooked.
They're urging the votes to be counted quickly. That's how they vote in
crooked,
California.
just like you're crooked. Your press is crooked, and Meet the Press is crooked.
To be fair, I'm not crooked, but let's
Really?
Let's
Well,
continue.
you play right into their hands. Then.
Let's continue.
You're either crooked or you're stupid.
Let's
you play
continue.
right into their hands with this rap.
All the way to Wisconsin for this interview.
And that was the end of the interview. It was an interview that was heavily interrupted by some heavy rain that was in Wisconsin, where that interview was taking place. Kristen Welker did say later on her Meet the Press broadcast that they did agree to do a follow-up interview. So whether some of that stuff will be addressed or not, that will be a different case. But President Trump's criticisms obviously are part of a wider trend of him being very adamantly opposed to a lot of the voting methods in which Democrats in particular heavily rely on. Of course, there have been many, many unverified claims of election interference, election fraud, dead people voting that stem back to his election victory in 2016 and, of course, his 2020 election loss to Joe Biden, something that he's continuing to litigate now in his second term.
Yeah, and this has been a person who is under the belief that elections should be decided in a day. But this is also someone who participates in mail-in voting, and as he has every right to, as a voter in the state of Florida, who obviously spends a lot of time in D.C. As well as other places because of his role as president, but then also just because of the fact that he has properties everywhere. But he's able to participate in absentee and mail-in voting. But I think for this idea that elections should be decided in a day. There should be no mail-in ballots. I think per usual, it's usually, I think we'll end up all agreeing as a country that somewhere in the middle is probably reasonable. I don't think there are many people who would, like, as Kristen Welker pointed out there in that conversation, officials here in California acknowledge that this is a slow process. I believe we could potentially see change.
We started off today's show by talking about Gavin Newsom was one of the people in the lead up to this election,
voters.
Really kind of banging that drum, trying to make sure that speed and efficiency was one of the utmost priorities for this election.
And I look, a little bit of this is because of policies that have been put in place by this administration, by the Newsom administration, in terms of having everybody receive a mail-in ballot, and the fact that a lot of people are going to utilize those mail-in ballots if they do not have to go in person or take that extra step to register for a mail-in ballot.
And I think another factor in this one in particular, like we've mentioned, is that ballot clutching thing. The mail-in ballots that are counted first are the ones that are mailed in the earliest.
Yes.
So if you have already made your mind going in, you watched all the debates leading up to May 2nd, May 3rd, May 4th, when you started to see those ballots come in, and you immediately, opened it up, circled your candidate, and sent it into a local drop-off box, your vote was already counted.
Yeah.
Your vote was counted, tabulated, and basically put on standby until, like we mentioned, up until 2 hours after the polls closed on June 2nd, it's out there. But if you were one of those who was waiting to read the tea leaves, waiting for everything to get a little bit clearer, see if was it really going to be Becerra, who was that lead polling candidate going into election, which he ended up being, then you made that decision, well, your vote's going to get counted. But when is it going to get counted is going to be a different matter. And
what's great too is that actually, at least here in San Diego County, I believe in most counties too, is that there's a ballot tracker. You can literally track what process your ballot is in at the moment. And you will see, like you said, if you dropped off your ballot prior to Election Day, you're already counted. If you dropped it off on Election Day, there's a good chance that it might be counted today or it was counted on Friday. So that's the process. But that process could change.
Yeah.
And not necessarily by California's government. This was another topic that we brought up, and in large part because of not necessarily a development, but I think it's notable that we are obviously having this conversation about California's mail-in ballot system. And this was something that Esmeralda Perez, our reporter here at CBS 8, did a story on, but I think it's a good one because it brings up a reminder. The Supreme Court currently has a case in front of it right now that it likely could rule on later this month. Of course, they sort of rule as they go on a lot of these cases, but it could impact a total of 14 states that count ballots after Election Day. Many of them have their own timelines. Here in California, again, it's 7 days after as long as it's postmarked by Election Day and received up to 7 days before. It was brought forth by the Republican National Committee and the Libertarian Party of Mississippi because they did not feel that the state's own law, which allowed mail-in ballots to be counted as long as they are postmarked by and then received within 5 business days of Election Day, arguing that it clashes with the federal law establishing what is election. We had oral arguments in March, and the conservative court appeared ready to rule in favor of the RNC and Libertarian Party of Mississippi. We spoke with legal analyst Dan Eaton about the case. Here's his take.
Those ballots, if the Supreme Court rules as expected, invalidating ballots in federal elections that arrive after Election Day, wouldn't count at all. The bottom line is that both parties are going to have to do a lot of work in making sure that their voters who vote by mail get those ballots in well before.
Yeah. So, you mentioned two things. First off, I think it's 100% correct there. The biggest effect out of a ruling like this, if they are to rule in favor of the RNC and the Libertarian Party of Mississippi, is both parties are going to be charged with a new public information campaign. It's not going to be it's not going to be the same as just, spending money on advertising for your candidate and making sure that they get the most airtime, that they're getting the most exposure. You're going to have to spend a lot of money making sure that your own voters in particular, the ones who you probably already know are going to vote for your party and your candidates, are able to get those ballots in at the right time. So both Republicans and Democrats are going to be charged here with another prong of their campaign, which is strictly going to be informational.
I think what's also very interesting about this is he makes very clear that this is likely going to impact federal elections. So we're talking about presidential elections, obviously your congressional and your Senate elections. But will there then be confusion amongst those who, because again, we have local races as well too. Are we going to see that potentially ballots, your section in which you cross on a congressional candidate, if maybe you still vote via California law? Let's say that ballots need to be received for federal elections, whatever their ruling ends up being. Let's just hypothetically say it's on Election Day, that the ballot has to be in by Election Day, not 7 days post. Let's say you get it in 2 days post, which still qualifies for California law. Would your congressional and Senate votes on the ballot not count? Would the entire ballot not count?
Yeah.
Because
I've just in my research streamline everything.
In my research of this, I've seen it refer to federal elections. But obviously, even in federal elections, we have local, down ballot races. So how is this going to impact? And I think that that's going to be part of the sort of informational campaign.
Yes.
Because again, this all seems likely to happen. That there 14 states here are going to have their system for these post. Again, they're postmarked by Election Day. But I've seen a lot of people say in their critique of this potential ruling, this is akin to being told that you have to write your check and mail in your tax payment a week prior, because for a lot of people, again, you're trying to get it in because it has to be received by the IRS by tax day before you get a late penalty. So the vote has to be in by Election Day to count. So you're probably gonna have to send it in a week before if you're gonna do a mail-in ballot.
Yeah. So, a lot of challenges that are going to be posed in individual states. I think what's that number again? 14 states.
14 states
that
in total.
currently have some sort of postmarking rules in place. I know the number that we saw in a lot of these were 5 days. I think Mississippi's is 5 days. California, 7 days.
7
days.
A
lot.
And
even
Mississippi's
more
is
lenient.
5 business days. California is 7 days. So
there's situations in which it's pretty much the same. So, but I mean, and I don't mean this in a negative connotation, but it is a permissive structure in which they allow people to make sure that they're getting in, because it really is a balance between efficiency and access. And I think that we have seen California really advocate on the side of access. And while, I don't think anyone is opposed to the concept of more people having the ability to vote, confidence is something that can be scrutinized, and it can be something, whether you think that that is for valid reasons or not for valid reasons. I think that if you are a critic of the California system, there's two different camps that for the most part you belong in. I understand that there's nuance, but it's either you think that there is malevolence at play or incompetence at play. If you're President Trump, you lean much more in the malevolence camp. If you're Steve Hilton, at least from the public comments that we're seeing, it seems like he is much more in the incompetence camp. But there is a wide range of scrutiny. And then if you're a Gavin Newsom, I don't think you think it's either malevolent or incompetent, but you do understand that that exists out there. So there's pressures everywhere to, if not change the system in itself, to instill confidence. How do you instill that confidence on a greater scale? Who knows? Because we're having this conversation right now about the California primary, and we're having this conversation about the LA mayoral race, which is nationally paid attention to races, but it doesn't have any real effect on the national balance of power. We're going to have a lot of races here in California in November. We think more specifically, just off the top of my head, the Kevin Kiley district. I think that's the 6th district. You mentioned Jim Desmond, the 48th district. These are Prop 50 districts that have been redrawn. These are what Governor Newsom and those who drew up these maps thought were the races that were going to give Democrats the biggest advantages on this redistricting battle. And we're seeing that there is a challenge ahead of them. So we're going to see this conversation play out on a much larger scale, potentially. The Supreme Court ruling might have a say into what we end up seeing in November, but there is an opportunity and there is a scenario where the conversations we're having now are just a microcosm for what could be a dominant conversation here in just a few months.